Will you join me in a word of prayer? O Lord, open thou our hearts to hear, and through thy word to us draw near. Let us thy word, heir pure, retain. Let us thy children and heirs remain. Amen. It's nice to feel the outside air and breeze going through here today. As I think about the Gospels and about Jesus preaching in the Gospels, I think he probably did as much preaching outside as he did inside, if not maybe more. Because whenever he was inside, it was always limited. There was always somebody who was outside and couldn't get in. The walls always separated him from somebody. There were often crowds that were too many to get in the doors, and so there were some who would dig through the roof to try to get access to Jesus. There were some, like his family, who would just send notes and messages through the crowd from outside to in to get to Jesus. But when Jesus was outside, crowds came from everywhere. And they filled the countryside, so many that in our gospel it says that the disciples couldn't get away from the crowds, even to have a quiet moment to rest and to eat. And so they would get in a boat and they would go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But the crowds would anticipate the trajectory, and they'd make it there on foot and get there before Jesus and his disciples even arrived. Sometimes as many as 5,000 men, not counting women and children. And I wonder if Jesus liked it that way. It says he had compassion on it. Fed them. Now, I know there's sometimes where walls were important. And sometimes when you just needed a quiet place, an upper room somewhere for that Last Supper with the 12 disciples, for instance. But our second lesson for today that was read to you from Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14 said this, talking about Jesus. He himself is our peace, who has made us both one and broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. And then if we pick up at verse 18, if you want to follow along, this is on page 4 of your service folder. Verse 18 of Ephesians 2, for through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father. So then you're no longer strangers and aliens, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure, being joined together, grows into a holy temple for the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. It's verses 18 to 22 of our epistle lesson, Ephesians chapter 2. This is going to be the text we're going to focus on today. Paul's talking about Jesus building this church and how Jesus tore down the walls of hostility. Now, the wall that Paul is talking about in this text, when he talks about Jesus tearing down the walls of hostility in his flesh, is the wall that separated the children of Israel from everyone else in the world. And there wasn't a physical wall, but nonetheless it was a demarcation, demarking who were the children of God and who were not the children of God. And I say it's not a physical wall. Well, it's not a physical wall per se, but there were physical manifestations of it. So, for example, in Jerusalem, in the temple, there was a wall around the inner court. The inner court where the Israelites could go, separating it from the outer courts, the court of the Gentiles. And no Gentile could cross that barrier. And so when he's talking about the separation between the children of Israel and the rest of the world, there was a physical manifestation of it right there in the temple where people worship the Lord. And that barrier was on Paul's mind as he's writing this letter to the Ephesians. Because in the very next chapter, this is chapter 2, in chapter 3, verse 2, Paul said, chapter 3, verse 1, that he is a prisoner of Christ on behalf of the Gentiles. And when he's writing this letter, Paul's in prison. And do you remember the occasion that put Paul in prison when he wrote this letter? Well, if you go back to Acts chapter 21, Paul's ending his third mission journey. And as he ended that mission journey, he was on his way back to Jerusalem from the areas of Macedonia and Greece, and he stopped in Asia Minor on the way. Made a quick stop at Miletus to visit with the Ephesian pastors and church leaders, and after that went to Jerusalem. That was his last stop in Asia Minor, was with the Ephesians. And then he went to Jerusalem, and when he was there, spent a week in worship in the temple. And at the end of that week, Paul's arrested. Now, why is he arrested? Acts chapter 21, verse 28. The people said of Paul, he even brings Greeks into the temple and defiles this holy place. Now, why would they say that of him? Acts chapter 21, verse 29. Because they had seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city of Jerusalem, and they supposed that he had brought him into the temple. Across that barrier, which no Gentile, no matter how God-fearing, should ever cross. And so Paul was arrested. And it led to a 2-year imprisonment in Jerusalem and Caesarea, and actually then another few years in Rome. Paul's been in prison for up to 4 years by the time he writes this letter to the Ephesians. All because of their supposing him bringing Trophimus the Ephesian across that barrier. And actually, it would have been worse than that. Because for the last 4 years that Paul's been in prison, the Jewish leaders have been petitioning all the Roman officials to put Paul to death. You see, they would have done it themselves the very day it happened with their own stones if the Roman cohort that was keeping security of the temple had not stepped in to stop the ruckus and prevent it from happening. And they arrested Paul and they put him in a Roman prison there in Jerusalem. But he was moved from Jerusalem shortly after that. Moved from Jerusalem to Caesarea. A distance of, I think, about 30 miles is all. But he was moved to Caesarea because the Roman tribune, the one who was in charge of the cohort there at the temple, recognized that there was an assassination plot afoot. That the Jewish leaders had made a pledge that they were going to put Paul to death, even while he was in prison. And so in the middle of the night, the Roman soldiers took Paul and moved him from the prison in Jerusalem to the prison in Caesarea. And when they moved him, they used a guard of 200 Roman foot soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 Roman spearmen. 470 men, 470 Roman soldiers, just to guard this one prisoner who they moved in the middle of the night. So great was the wall of hostility between the Jews and the Gentiles that that's what it took to move Paul to a prison in Caesarea. And it's all because of the Ephesian Trophimus. Not really. He didn't actually go into the temple courts. And yet Paul writes this letter to the Ephesians. And he tells them, here's the mystery of God for you. That the dividing wall of hostility has been torn down in Jesus. Through Jesus' death and resurrection, that dividing wall exists no more. And so you go back to the very beginning of our lesson. Paul says, remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh, that's called the uncircumcision, by those who are called the circumcision, and that by the flesh, done with hands. Remember that at one time you were separated from Christ. You were aliens, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope, and you were without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near through the blood of Christ. You've been brought near through the blood of Christ. And how this happened? Well, we jump down to verse 15. Because Christ abolished the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, so that he might create in himself one new man out of the two, so making peace and reconcile us both to God through one body, through his body, through the cross. Jesus brought together Jew and Gentile. Through his death and resurrection, there was no distinction now between the children of Israel and the rest of the world. All were one. All were God's people in Christ Jesus. That physical manifestation of the wall that was still there, standing in Jerusalem, didn't mean anything because Christ had already torn down that dividing wall. In fact, that little physical manifestation of it there at the Jerusalem temple, you know, the one that was built out of those stones that Herod the Great had built there, those multi-ton stones that built that wall that separated the court of the Gentiles from the inner courts of the Jerusalem temple. Well, Jesus said about that wall, looking at those stones, I tell you, there will not be here one stone that will be standing upon another which will not be thrown down. Mark 13, verse 2. And in a mere 10 years after, not even, Paul wrote this letter to the Ephesians, what Jesus said had come true. That wall had come down as well. This dividing separation had been torn down. Jesus is the one who tears down walls. Now, the tearing down of that wall between Jew and Gentile always been an issue within the church. Going back to the beginning days of the gospel, this was an issue. So it was a struggle for the people who were the first believers in Christ Jesus. Go back to the book of Acts, chapter 6. That's the first real disagreement in the churches between the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenistic Jews, the ones that were too close to being Gentiles. And were they going to be treated fairly in the church? And so the apostles had to appoint 7 new leaders in the church just to make sure that the widows got their fair share. Both the ones that seemed to be too Gentile-like, the Hellenistic Jews, as well as the Hebraic ones who had believed in Jesus. And then you go a few chapters later, chapter 10 and 11, and the Lord has to give Peter multiple visions, at least 3 different visions, to convince Peter that, yes, Peter, I want you to go to the house of this Gentile Cornelius, and I want you to eat with him, and I want you to baptize him and his family. And at first, Peter won't do it, but the Lord has to convince him. And then once Peter does go and do it, then he's got to answer to that before the rest of the church, why he went and did that. Well, and then Acts chapter 15, this is the whole discussion of the First Jerusalem Council. The discussion is, can Gentiles come and actually be believers in Jesus without converting to Judaism first and keeping all the laws of Moses, like circumcision? And they decided that yes, they can, because Jesus has broken down this dividing wall of hostility. They too can be part of the people of God through Jesus Christ. And yet, that same sentiment had spread far beyond Jerusalem. It was already there in the first mission places of the church, hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem. When Paul went on his first mission journeys to Galatia, this is the issue that he ran into there, between Jews and Gentiles. And so that after coming back from that first mission journey, he had to write his first letter, and he wrote it to the Galatians in order to denounce that separation and that wall and tell them that it had been torn down. And in doing so, he tells them a story about Peter. Peter, who had been one of the first to tear down this wall after the Lord convinced him through this series of visions, and then begun starting erecting it again. Erecting it in Syria and Antioch when he went to visit the believers there, because there, the Jewish believers did not eat with the Gentile believers. And so when Peter went there, he stopped eating with the Gentile believers and only ate with the Jewish believers. And Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, I had to oppose him to his face. A dividing wall of hostility. I like to think of myself as actually better at tearing down walls than building them up. So a couple of years ago, when Christian Youth Theater moved into its current facility down near Freya, Maine, when they moved into that facility, it needed some renovations because they needed to turn it into studios, and it had previously been medical labs. And so the rooms in it were very small and filled with cabinets and countertops. Now the square footage of the overall facility was a good size, perfect size for what Christian Youth Theater needed. But a lot of walls inside that facility needed to be torn down. And so they had volunteer parties come in and work parties do work. And so I volunteered just one day to be a part of that demolition crew. So I put on my gloves, and I took my heaviest hammer, and I took a crowbar and my hard hat, and I went there. And it was a lot of fun. I learned I'm pretty good at taking down walls. And so they just pointed me to a wall. Now, there were some of them there that had sawzalls and other kind of equipment, but I didn't need that. They just pointed me to a wall and said, this one needs to come down. And I'd start working on it. And we had a lot of fun that day. There were probably 30 volunteers there. And by the end of this one afternoon that we were working in this one area of the building we were working on, trying to turn it into a studio, we who started out being in all these individual rooms were suddenly in one room together because we had teared down all the walls. What a great thing to do, to be able to just tear down the walls and come together. I like to think I'm good at tearing down walls. But it's a lot easier to tear down walls, physically speaking, than it is to tear down walls between people. And that's why this was such a struggle for the early church. Because even though the Romans had come and destroyed that physical wall that was in the temple when they tore down the temple, there was still this wall, this barrier that remained between the Jews and the Gentiles. Now, that's not our issue. This barrier between Jews and Gentiles, we're not dealing with that controversy anymore. And yet, I fear that oftentimes we are much better at erecting walls than we are at tearing them down. And oftentimes they're walls of hostility. Walls that show up because of hurts and differences between us and somebody else. And as we talked about last week, those walls can come down through the forgiveness of Christ and should come down because what goes around does not need to come around in Jesus anymore. And so, Lord, forgive us for being erectors of those kind of walls instead of those who bring them down. Help us be better demolishers of those walls. In your name. And yet that's not the only reason we build walls. See, we do build walls of hostility. But we also build walls for security. And that's a good reason to build walls. So that we can have comfort and protection. And we know the boundaries of where it is safe for us to live and to work and to love. And so we have those kind of walls around us all the time. Now, have you heard the research that they've done? This is years ago. Research about playgrounds in elementary schools where kids play, whether they should be fenced or not fenced. Now, when I grew up, the playground at the elementary school I went to did not have a fence. I noticed here in Spokane, everywhere where my kids went to school, there was always a fence around the playground. Well, the research they did a number of years ago said that when there are fences around the playground at a school, the kids will tend to venture out and use the entire playground. And they don't pay as much attention to the teacher. They just spread out and enjoy their playtime, and oftentimes they'll play close to those fences. But they'll never cross those fences because they know they can't cross them. And so they stay in that defined bounds and in those areas. But they're free to play and do what they want. And on behalf of the teachers, it's a great thing. Because the teachers don't have to wonder, are they going to go too far? The teachers don't have to answer lots of questions to the kids about, well, can I go that far? No, you can't go that far. You can't come this far. And, oh, yeah, you can go over there, but you can't go there. And they don't have to. They can instead be secure that the children are safe and comfortable and let them play where they want to play. And just kind of keep an eye on general safety. But if there's no walls in the playground, the research found that the children tend to cluster closer to the teacher. Now, I remember when I was a kid in the playground, and there was the playground area and the soccer field, and then way off on the other end of the church property was a softball diamond. And it was way over there. So I remember there was one year where we boys wanted to play baseball at recess. But we didn't want to venture that far away unless we knew we could. And so we went and asked the teacher, can you go over there and play baseball? Yeah, you can go over there and play baseball. And then we went over there and played baseball. Because when there's no boundaries, the children tend to cluster closer around the teacher because they're not sure how far they can go or how far it's safe to go, and they want to feel safe and comfortable around the teacher. And so they cluster more around. Now, this is speaking in generalities. I'm sure there were cases that weren't quite like this. And so walls are a good thing, because when you put fences around the playground, it's good for the kids. They know how far they can go. They know how far they're safe. It's good for the teachers. They don't have to pay as close attention to the kids. They can just kind of watch over the general safety. And it's good for the use of the playground because the kids use the entire playground. Now watch what happens then when we take that and apply it to the church. And why apply it to the church? Because that's what Jesus is talking about in our lesson for today. That's what Paul is writing to us about, right? He's writing to us about the church of Jesus Christ. He talks about how we are that church. At the end of our lesson, he said that we are being built on the foundations of the apostles and of the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together becomes a holy temple in the Lord. And so we are being built into that dwelling place for God by his Spirit. He's talking about the church. Now watch what happens when we apply this to the church. Well, first of all, when we think of church, first thing we tend to think about is a building. Paul's talking about a building. We're being built on the cornerstone of Jesus, the foundation of the apostles and prophets. When we think about a building, we think of something that has walls, right? And walls define boundaries. And so if the walls define the boundaries of the church, just think about Holy Cross Lutheran Church, the physical building Holy Cross Lutheran Church for a minute. If we let the walls define the boundary of this church and where it is safe to live and move and work and do our ministry, these walls provide that protection, then all of a sudden our focus becomes the people who are inside these walls. And we care about and we love and we minister to the people who come and who are inside these walls. Members, non-members, you're inside these walls, we care about you. The ministry that we care about that we support, that we fund, is the ministry that happens inside these walls. And so if it takes place here at church, it's a good thing. We're happy about it. We support it. But notice what that does to everything outside the walls. It puts a demarcation, a separation between us and what's out there. That this is what matters, and that doesn't matter because this is where I'm comfortable. Let's take that a step further. So I'm just talking about Holy Cross Lutheran Church as a physical building right now. But now let's just talk about Christianity. And Christianity is not a physical building, but if it is a church and it's being built, as Paul's saying here, on Jesus, then Christianity must have some walls. And we begin to think in those terms and think, okay, what is it that divides people who are Christian from people who are not Christian? How can I tell who's inside and who's outside? And so we start to put some parameters on that too. We start to think of things like, well, somebody who worships in a Christian church at least this often would be considered a Christian. And then somebody who doesn't, well, then they're not. Or somebody who reads their Bible at least this many times a week could be considered a Christian, or maybe not. Or the person who gives this much money, they'd be considered a real Christian. But somebody who doesn't, maybe not. Or somebody who, fill in the blank. We put all these demarcations around who is Christian and who is not in order to build sort of this safe space in which to live and work and serve as a Christian community. Now, I'm going to take that a step further and say, what about our church body? So Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, we're a Lutheran church body. And so for us, the temptation is not necessarily to talk about what does it mean to be Christian, what does it mean to be serve at Holy Cross, but we tend to think about what does it mean to be Lutheran, to preserve our Lutheran identity. And we're tempted to say things like, well, what makes a church really Lutheran? Well, it must be the style of worship. Must be the kind of worship services and the hymnal we use. Must be the organ music that makes us truly Lutheran, or the hymns that we sing. Must be the way that we instruct new people, this course of catechism that we go through. If we have these things, then we can say we're truly Lutheran. And we like to put those kind of boundaries on things because it's helpful to us. We put those kind of boundaries on things, whether it's the ministry of Holy Cross, or it's what it means to be Christian, or what it means to be truly Lutheran. We put those kind of boundaries on things, and it makes it easy because I know how far I can go and how far is not good to go. And I don't have to pay close attention to the teacher because I can play out there by the edges. If I know that to be a Christian, I just have to go to church this many times a month, well then, I can just go to church just that many times a month. I just need to read my Bible once a week. Okay, I read my Bible once a week. I go to church once a week. That makes me Christian. I give this certain amount of money. That makes me Christian. Okay, I can just give that amount. And we play out there around the edges, but we never go beyond. Because we know that's the boundary. And that's where I play. And so if this is what makes it to be Lutheran, then that's where I'll play, right there. And I won't go beyond that boundary. If this is what it means to be Holy Cross Lutheran Church, to participate in the ministry here, I'll go that far and I won't go beyond the boundary. And yet think about what it means to be a disciple and what Jesus said. First of all, Jesus is our teacher, just like he was of the people in the gospel lesson, right? And Jesus even said that. He said, you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. Matthew 23, verse 8. You have one teacher. So Jesus is the teacher. So if Jesus is our teacher, does he want us not paying attention to him, but just playing around with the edges? Or does he want us in relationship to him and drawing closely to him? Well, in a model of discipleship, that's what Jesus wants, right? He wants each of us drawing close to him in relationship. And does he want a definite line that says, here's where you cannot cross because this is the edge of what it means to be church? And so, as long as you don't cross this line, you're truly church? Or does he send his church out? And when he sends his church out, does he want us to go defined based on boundaries and borders? Or do we go based upon what he tells us and where he sends us? You see, in a playground, think about this with the playground with kids again. In a playground with kids, in a playground that does not have fences, the kids ask the teacher, can I go over there? You can go over there. Can I go over there? You can't go over there. And we do what the teacher says to do. If Jesus is the teacher and we draw near to him, if we're going to go somewhere beyond a boundary, it's because Jesus told us to. And if we're going to stop, and not go further, it's because Jesus says no. And we look to Jesus to make these decisions. But if there's a fence and a boundary, then I limit my interaction with the world on the other side of that boundary. But if I'm looking to Jesus as a teacher of my faith, and I'm drawing close to him, then my interaction with the world outside is going to be like his interaction with the world. And Jesus crossed boundaries. Ate with tax collectors and sinners, even though the religious establishment, the Pharisees, said that wasn't the right thing to do. Jesus healed the Syrophoenician woman and the Canaanite woman. And he told his disciples that they were to take the message of the gospel to the ends of the earth. Jesus wants us to be willing to cross those boundaries, whatever they might be, geographic, socioeconomic, ethnic, for the sake of the gospel. And he wants all to draw near to him. So how do we define that? If we can't define what is church by boundaries and walls, then how do we define what is the church? What Jesus said, John chapter 12, verse 32. I, when I am lifted up the earth, will draw all people to myself. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 3 defines discipleship very well. It says we look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You see, we've been brought into this faith by Jesus. And he's the one we look to. And so what defines who's a part of this faith? Well, it's not where you are, what gathering you're a part of. It's who you look to. Who do you look to? Do you look to Jesus as the author and perfecter of faith? And you're part of this temple that's being built. It's a temple that's built without walls. This is already prefigured in the Old Testament. This isn't just an apostolic thing in the New Testament, it's a prophetic thing in the Old Testament. And so after the exile, when the children of Israel were taken to Babylon, and then they returned to Jerusalem, what's the first two things they did when they got to Jerusalem? They rebuilt the temple and rebuilt the wall around Jerusalem. And the Lord sent the prophet Zechariah to them. And when he sent the prophet Zechariah to them, in chapter 2 of Zechariah's prophecy, Zechariah sees a vision. He sees a lot of visions, but he saw a vision of an angel with a measuring rod who was going to measure the width and the length of Jerusalem to see how big it was when they rebuilt it. And then there was another angel that came, wiser and more mature than that first angel, who corrected the first angel. Here's how Zechariah writes about it. I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there was a man with a measuring line in his hand. And I said, where are you going? And he said to me, to measure Jerusalem and see what its width and its length are. And behold, an angel came afterwards, who talked with me and came forward to meet him and said to him, you run and tell that young man, Zechariah, that Jerusalem shall be inhabited as a city without walls. Stop measuring the walls. Because Jerusalem is going to be a city without walls. You keep reading in Zechariah chapter 2, and the Lord said, I myself will be the wall. You don't need to build walls. And the promise was that this is what was going to happen in the days of the Messiah. Okay, you came back from exile, you built walls, you won't always need those walls, because in the days of Messiah, Jerusalem will be a city without walls. My church will be a church without walls. So what does that mean then? How do we even conceive of that? If the church is being built on the foundations of the apostles and the prophets, and we're being built up to be a holy temple of the Lord and a dwelling place for God by his Spirit, how can we be that if we have no walls? It just doesn't make sense in our mode of thinking. And so let me give you one last example that might help. And the example is church. Now we're used to hearing the word church, and when we hear of it, we think of a couple things. We think of the building around us, or we think of the people who gather in the building. Church. Right? And more properly, it's the people. Church. The word for church in the New Testament is ecclesia. That's the Greek word for church. And in Greek, that word, all the way up until the time of the New Testament, had meant an assembly of people, a gathering of people. We might say a crowd or an audience. Just like if you go to the Spokane Indians game, you're a part of the crowd. Just like if you go to the IMB to see a performance, you're a part of the audience. But you're only a part of the crowd, part of the audience, part of the gathering, part of the assembly while you're there, right? You go to Spokane Indians game, you watch the game, you're part of the crowd. But you leave the game, you come home, you're not part of the crowd anymore. You were part of the crowd, but now you're not part of the crowd. You go to the IMB to see a performance. While you're there watching the performance, you're part of the audience. But then afterwards, the audience goes home. When you go home, you're not part of the audience anymore. You were part of the audience, and now you're not. That's what the word ecclesia meant, and that's how it was used in Greek, all the way up until the time of the New Testament. The apostles started to use the word in a different way than it had ever been used before. When they used the word ecclesia for church, it was a word for gathering, an assembly of those who gather around Jesus, who gather around his word, who gather around his sacraments. But you remained part of the ecclesia, part of the church, even when you went home from that gathering. Even if you went on a mission field somewhere hundreds of miles away from that gathering place. No matter where in the world you were, at what time you were still part of the assembly, part of the gathering, a part of the church. Because all of a sudden, physical space and time made no difference anymore. It didn't matter where you were or when you were still built upon the same foundation of the apostles and prophets, with your cornerstone being Jesus Christ, and therefore you were the temple of God. You were church, the dwelling place of God by his Spirit. And that's a whole different mindset than building walls. See, we're a church without walls. We're a church without walls. And we are built on those believers in Jesus who have looked to Jesus down through the ages, across the world, in different countries, in different places, in different times, who worship differently, who talk differently, who have different ways of instructing. They're people in Jesus of all ages. And we are part of that same church with them. Because Jesus has torn down the walls of hostility. And so put on your gloves, grab your hammer, grab your crowbar, that hard hat if you need it, this week, and see if you can tear down some walls for Jesus. Well, second thought, maybe you don't need all that stuff. You got forgiveness? You got the love of Christ? That's all you really need. In Jesus' name.